I'm constantly in feminist spaces and, in spaces where people have such a strong commitment to the freedom of Palestinians. But they are embarrassed by religion. They're embarrassed by the discussion of religion. And so I am constantly challenging them. Last year, I wrote an opinion piece when Netanyahu made his speech at the United Nations I think it was around September at the end. And he was citing scripture left, right, and center, like he was a rabbi almost, And I use that as an example in my opinion piece to say that we cannot dismiss religion as some dismiss it as these are just silly people, and actually the issue here is politics, and the issue is land, and the issue is if we can just get the politics right, we'll resolve this. Religion is at the heart of this, and we can't keep dismissing religion. So we have to reckon seriously, and this is my challenge, is how to engage academics and how to engage people who have their hearts are in the right places, but they don't take religion seriously, is for how, like, look, this is what's being done. Religion is at the heart of this.
Friends, I invite you to consider attending the Christ at the Checkpoint conference. It's happening in Bethlehem on May 26th until the 30th. This is the flagship conference of the Bethlehem Institute for Peace and Justice. The tagline of the conference is Kingdom Ethics in the Face of War and Genocide. The conference brings together Christians from around the world to explore questions of faith, peace, and justice. Especially at this moment in history, the conference offers a biblically grounded and culturally rich space for honest engagement, faithful discipleship, and solidarity that are rooted in the person of Christ and in his teachings. So come and join us as an act of presence. Come and bear witness to our shared faith and hope as we see Christ at the checkpoint. To register and to get more information, visit christatthecheckpoint.com. Again, that is christatthecheckpoint.com. I hope to see you there. Hey friends, welcome back to Across the Divide for another fascinating conversation. I am joined here by Sarojini Nadar, a South African Old Testament scholar who specializes in the study of gender and religion. She's also the director of the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice. Here in this episode, we discuss a very tough topic, which is a phenomenon that many of us have reflected on and wrestled with, which is the propensity for many people, especially Christians, to weaponize the Bible, to find in the Bible a way to justify violence and especially the genocide in Gaza. In this conversation, we discuss the Book of Esther and how that book that tells the story of a peasant Jewish woman, Esther, who was victimized and abused, who suddenly at the end of that book becomes a victimizer and an abuser who was responsible for the killing of thousands of people to avenge what was happening to her. The victimized becomes the victimizer. So we reflect on that story and how we tended to flatten and to simplify the story into a Sunday school story, then wrestle with the hard text and with the tension that the text creates for us. And hopefully to learn to develop the tools, put on the lens that help us see the text with all its complexity and to help us wrestle with violence and how the text could be used by many of us to justify violence. So here's my conversation with Sarojini Nadar. Welcome to Across the Divide, Sarojini. We've been trying hard for months now to get you to come to the podcast. Finally worked out. I'm so pleased to have you here with me. So as we kick off this conversation on the weaponization of the scriptures and how do we think about all of that and more, just for the audience who maybe cannot see you if they're listening and they're not watching this on YouTube, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and what you do?
Great. Thank you for having me, Daniel. And I'm glad that we finally get to have the conversation. So my name is Sarojini Nadar. I hold the Desmond Tutu Chair in Religion and Social Justice here at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. That's in Cape Town, the beautiful city of Cape Town. my classical training is in the study of Hebrew Bible, but I prefer to be I'm a more interdisciplinary scholar, so I hate being put into that box of biblical scholar because I think I do so much more than that. I feel that the world doesn't have singular problems, and therefore we cannot have singular disciplines and cannot be put into singular disciplines. So, but I trained as a Hebrew Bible scholar. That's my work. My undergraduate degree is actually in English literature, and I kind of got into religion, tangentially almost into the study of religion. But that's what I do.
Okay, so Desmond Tutu, so that means that you are in South Africa.
Yes.
But also, for those who cannot see you, you also come from an Indian background. That
Yes.
might be a bit interesting to people. How come you're South African, but also Indian? Can you tell us briefly about that history of Indian migration, and also the history of apartheid and how that affected, Indian South Africans?
So my ancestors were brought, and I use the word brought deliberately. They were brought by the British in 1860 to work on the sugarcane plantations. There was a booming sugar refining industry in South Africa, and they were brought to work on these sugarcane plantations. Indians came to South Africa in different groups. So there were those that came as indentured laborers, which is my ancestors. They came to work on the sugarcane plantations, and there were those that came as business people, as people who came to trade, basically. Indenture, in my understanding, is actually a euphemism for slavery, because slavery was becoming out of fashion. So the British sort of reinvented it. And I say that because, they were required to sign contracts that forced them to work for 7 years, under quite brutal conditions, and this is documented. It's a good over 100 years that Indians have been in South Africa. In apartheid South Africa, interestingly enough, Indians were also classified as non-white, so were placed in areas that were predominantly Indian. And so I, for example, grew up in an Indian area. I went to an Indian church. I went to an Indian school because, that was how society was divided. I went to university. In my first year of university was 1994, and it was the first time I actually interacted with white people. I hadn't interacted with white people before in my life up until 1994, which incidentally is also when South Africa became free and we had our first democratic elections. So that's a little bit about my ethnic background and how.
And Indian South Africans were considered colored people within the apartheid system. So you had the black African, South African, and then the colored would be you. So you would be still within that system of apartheid, would be a colored person, right?
But interestingly, not colored. So
Oh, okay.
Again, racial classification was slightly absurd. Okay, maybe not so
Sure,
slightly.
of course.
Maybe
Of
not
course.
so slightly, but there were
Right.
four major racial classifications. It was white, colored, Indian, black, and
Oh, okay. So you had your own category. Interesting. Okay.
that was, and colored was loosely, and I say this loosely, used to designate people who were considered biracial. Many
That's
scholars
right.
now are contesting that and saying, of course, it's not just biracial people, but people of all sorts of backgrounds. Also, people who were enslaved, and not necessarily biracial, but loosely translated, colored was used to designate people who were biracial. Indians were another category. So Indians were classified Asian. Interestingly enough, also colored people within that category, there was colored and there was other colored. And other colored were people who could pass for being white, for looking white. So
Wow. Yeah.
absurd
Right?
classifications, but yeah, that's how
Well, I mean, racism and apartheid in itself is absurd. And
absurd. Exactly, exactly.
okay, I mean, I'm asking you these kind of biographical questions, which I think would help us for the audience also to understand who you are and how that background influences your own academic work, theological work on the scriptures, especially when you think about violence and the instrumentalization of scriptures for violence and for what we, the genocide in Gaza, which is kind of the main conversation I want to have with you here, especially because you wrote a book on this, just came out last year. It's titled Gender, Genocide, Gaza, and the Book of Esther, and a very fascinating and rich book on basically how scripture, and especially through the Book of Esther, has become a very potent weapon, and how it's been used uh, to sell or to produce certain narratives about victory and about power and about violence. And you can tell us more about this, but Esther, this a peasant Jewish woman who probably was abused sexually by the king, and then eventually um, through a long, detailed story in the Book of Esther, becomes powerful. And Mordecai, her relative, basically, and herself, they scheme and defeat Haman. But eventually, the story ends with the slaughter of the local people, and also 75,000 people from around the region. Um, but then that story has always been told as a story of victory, of triumph, or maybe of like some kind of feminist kind of story of women power. But also that victim becomes responsible for what we can call a genocide in the Book of Esther. And not to spend too much detail here, but Peter Beinart wrote a book, a Jewish journalist and thinker, on being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza. And he also reflects on how the Book of Esther, like we go, we celebrate, we dance, and we party. We ridicule those who want to destroy us, and then we skip that part that we commit so much horrendous evil.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you can just kind of frame that conversation for us, and how that story in particular could help us understand how the text could be also a tool for violence that we normalize frequently.
Well, I think the Bible being used as justification for violence is probably as old as the Bible itself,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because I mean, it's not new. It's happened again and again across history. If we think about how Scripture was used to defend slavery in the United States and elsewhere, in South Africa, we've experienced this firsthand. Apartheid was born, in spaces of theology, in spaces where theology was being studied. Apartheid was born in those spaces. So it was used to both justify and sustain apartheid. The Bible has been used to exclude women from leadership. It's been used to say, women submit to your husbands. So sacred texts have repeatedly been drawn into the service of empire, into the service of patriarchy, in the service of domination. So this is what, part of what compelled me to write this book. But I originally set out to write about sexual violence in the Book of Esther. My focus was the harem, the young women, the way their bodies were controlled and commodified. But then October 2023 happened, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in his speech just before the assault on Gaza, basically invoked the what I call in the book the Amalekite trope. In it, he says that our holy scriptures tell us that we have to remember Amalek, and we remember Amalek. This is how he encouraged the defense forces to take action, to take military action. So what I realized in that moment was Amalek is in the Book of Esther too, right? And Amalek exists as through the lineage of Haman, who's the main antagonist in the book. The text tells us over and over again that Amalek is of the descendants of Agag, King Agag, and there's a long time enmity with them. And suddenly I realized I'm working with a text here that has implications in real life in this moment, texts that are being invoked here. And how can I, as a responsible feminist who wants to focus on sexual violence, bracket the ethnic violence of this text? And so that's how my book began to take this journey, if you like, from the harem to the harem. And I want to emphasize that the fact that I took this journey from the harem to the harem doesn't mean that I left the harem behind. What it means is that I saw the harem and the harem as co-constitutive. In other words, they are the basis of the same kinds of oppression. Now, I bet you want to know what is harem, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, let's unpack both terms for people. Yeah, go
okay,
ahead.
Sure. So harem, of course, is the place where women were kept, the women that were brought to the palace for the king's pleasure. This is the space that the women were kept in. But the Hebrew word for sort of official, if you like, official genocide, committing
divinely sanctioned
genocide is herem. It means to blot out your enemies, literally to blot out your enemies, to make them cease to exist, right? And there's a whole historical trajectory that we can trace of herem in the Hebrew Bible. And so what I argue is that in this particular text, what we see is herem happening, where the genocide is authorized in the name of God in this text, even though the name of God is not explicitly mentioned in the Book of Esther. So I don't leave the harem behind. So I don't leave my feminist concerns behind, but I bring my feminist concerns to bear on the ethnic violence in the text, because I believe that they both rest on the same axis of oppression.
Yeah, so for people who are listening, so the harem would be HAREM. They know that word. And then harem, hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, HEREM, and that's from the Hebrew word for the laws of war in the Hebrew scriptures. And we saw this throughout the scriptures of God sanctioning the killing of people and groups and so on. And so that's kind of standard theological term in the scriptures. So that's really, I love that you're creating a tension for us between how do you think about sexual violence and how Esther was also, and other women in that story who were nameless and silent, suffered from that because of the king. But then she becomes responsible for unspeakable evil as well. So it's interesting, right? Because you always saw Esther as a heroine here, as a hero who resists the patriarchy. So there's a beautiful kind of empowering story. How does she? How does she become someone who's responsible for evil, right? How does the text? I mean, it seems from the text it's just such a normal thing. It's like, yeah, this happened. They did that. That seems like legitimate violence. It's like killing 75,000 people. Of course, we can question the numbers. Like, are these numbers accurate? But are these hyperbolic language? Is this hyperbolic to make a point? But that seems that the narrative is a bit normative, that this seems to be legitimate and okay and maybe even righteous. How do you make sense of the way that the scripture includes those details without any kind of moral outrage about such action?
I feel like Esther, both in the Jewish context and in Christian context, is often read as a simple tale of survival. Right? This text tells us how God saved the Jewish people from destruction. Because remember, there was another genocide, a potential genocide in this text. It's not just Esther who, wants to genocide, the Persians and other people. It's Haman who first plots to kill the Jews, right? We know this. This is part of the text. And so this is a sort of the way in which it is portrayed, whether in Sunday school stories or in the festival of Purim, is this is a story of a heroine who basically saves her people from destruction. And so the means by which that is done tends to not be questioned, because it feels like people are getting their just desserts here. You're trying to mess around with one people, and this is what happens. And so somehow there's this veneer of justification that happens across the book, and so what I uncover in my reading, because I do a close as I said to you earlier, my undergraduate degree was in literature. So I'm always interested in narrative, right? And the way the narrative is constructed. And the way the narrative is constructed, it's constructed in a way to almost help you gloss over those parts. Like it's said with such brevity, in the same way that the virgins and the rape of the virgins, the institutionalized rape of the virgins, is dismissed almost in one verse, right? In Esther 2:14. In the evening she went in, and in the morning she came out. Obviously, that implies some sexual encounter, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
nobody reads the text that way. When we read it in Sunday school, or people read it for Mother's Day, or whatever people read it, they get to the "for such a time as this." Esther was, was there for such a time as this. And so in the same way that it glosses over the sexual violation of these women, the text equally glosses over and Haman and his 10 sons were hanged, and they vanquished the enemies, all 75,000 of them. It's treated in one sweep of the pen, if you like, and so the text itself doesn't allow you to interrogate its violence unless you read with a particular lens. And so this is where my decolonial Black feminist lens comes into play, because when you read with that lens, and as a survivor of childhood sexual violence myself, I am attuned to the ways in which sexual violence is made to feel normal, the ways in which it is normativized. Is that a word? Normativized. Normalized.
Normalize. There you go.
the way it becomes normative. And I use that same lens then, given the genocide that was unfolding in Gaza in that moment. I use that same lens, and I say, hang on a moment. If we read through these lenses, then we can also see the violence in this text, the ethnic violence that happens, the ethnic cleansing that happens. And so, Esther, your question was, how do we perhaps it's not how do we see Esther, but how do we not see Esther? And so how do we have to see, what does it take to see Esther in a different light? What tools do we need to unearth the kind of violence that happens in this text? And there again, I use, this theoretical framing that I term sacred economies of violence, because there's a whole economy of violence that sustains the text. The gendered and the racial and the ethnic and even the sexual. Right. If you, if you think about the role of the eunuchs in this text and how they are described, etc. So there's almost a lines of connection, various lines of connection that are all spinning on the same axis of oppression and domination. And that's what I try to uncover in the text.
I can imagine some of us might be getting uncomfortable seeing how that text is so blasé about these things and just mentions them in passing as if there's nothing wrong with them. And I have young kids, and I always struggle when I'm trying to read like biblical stories, which are nice Sunday school stories like Noah and other stories, and especially a lot of the stories in the Old Testament. And I'm like, I don't know, I need to like tweak the text to make it sound good, and also for the kid to get a good lesson out of it. Not that, hey, if a bad person does something bad, we need to like destroy them. There's a better way to read that text. And I want to get to that, how that the lens you're using, the feminist, decolonial, black, and all that stuff. But before we do that, I want to stick with the gender element, because we mentioned there's a lot of sexual abuse in the text and connect it with the Israeli response to the Hamas attacks. Because there was that what we think for the most part to be fabrications and lies about sexual abuse by Hamas or by other militants. Some of it might be true, just the data is not there, unfortunately, but we can safely assume that maybe there was some kind of sexual violence. For sure, in that kind of space, some of that could have happened. But obviously that, whether it was fabricated or not, that served as a very powerful tool to justify the genocide of the people in Gaza, just like the sexual abuse of Esther and other women might have justified the killing of the 500 people in that city and then beyond. Is there, and you're drawing a connection here, right? How sexual violence could become a potent device to justify genocide, right? Is that what's happening here?
It's both and. So there's two things. There's two ways in which I view the sexual violence in the text. On the one hand, I'm looking at what sustains sexual violence. What is the thinking that sustains sexual violence? And the thinking that sustains sexual violence is superiority, is power, right? It's male power. It's the idea that this gender is superior and therefore can dominate. And I use that then to argue that that's the same ideological underpinning that sustains ethnic violence. Ethnic violence is based on the idea that there's a superiority. I have power. I can dominate. You are less powerful, etc. So I'm looking at the sexual violence that happens in the harem as parallel to the sexual violence that happens in the harem. So it's based on the same system. So that's one. But two, there's also the sexual violence that is weaponized to justify the genocide. So if you think about the scene in chapter 5. Is it chapter 5? Yes, chapter 5, where Esther hosts a banquet, right? And she calls Haman to the banquet. And in chapter 5 or chapter 6, it's forever since I got to the book. But in that banquet, what she does is she basically reveals to the king both her own identity, which she was concealing, her Jewish identity from the king, and then in the same breath, she says, this man here, this is, your trusted advisor is the one who's trying to kill us. The king gets really angry, and he storms out of the room and goes into the garden. While he's gone, Haman starts to beg Esther for his life, right? So she's reclining on the couch. Imagine the scene. He goes to beg for his life, and the king walks in on it. And the king says, not only do you try to kill, these people, but now you are trying to molest my wife in my own palace. Esther says nothing. Esther doesn't correct him that's what's happening.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so it's immediately after that that the king gives her the power to kill all her enemies and do whatever, because now he's so angry, right? And so for me, that's a classic example of how sexual violence can be weaponized. Does that mean we don't believe women? Does that mean? Absolutely not. I'm not even entertaining that discussion. And I feel like I have the authority to say I'm not entertaining that discussion because I'm speaking from a very embodied experience of sexual violence. So I always believe survivors, right? We must believe survivors. But two things can be true at the same time. And so we are holding these two things in tension. We are holding the ways in which Esther herself uses sexual violence as a means to justify the killing of other of those who are deemed others in the text.
Yeah, I mean, Esther is becoming less and less of a heroine here. Even though obviously she went through a lot and it was very harsh for her, and like the abuse she had to deal with, but now there's this kind of, oh wait, I'm a queen and I'm beautiful and I'm seductive and I can wield my body and my power for my advantage. She seems more devious the more you think about it. I don't know if that's fair, like how you think about Esther.
And this is how privilege functions, right? In the book, I call it pretty privilege, because this is how privilege functions. You take something and you use it to your benefit. And when you use that privilege in the service of domination, in the service of oppression, that's when it becomes a problem. And so that's what happens with Esther. It doesn't take away her abuse. It doesn't take away the fact that she and these other young girls were trafficked, etc. But it also shows us how power is multiple, and how power is nuanced, and power never just operates in one direction only, right? We can see how people who are trained in the art of coloniality, because they themselves have been the victims of colonialism, can themselves become oppressors when they become rulers. We've seen this over and over again, the ways in which power corrupts. And I think Esther, provides us with that classic example of what happens when women get power that they can wield. And it's not just women. It's and this is why I think it's always important when I work in the area of social justice, which is a lot of my work, and if we do workshops or whatever, I'm always very careful to not talk about individual people, but to talk about systems, right? Of course, individuals, wield harm, and individuals are the people who actually act, but they act within systems, within structures of power and privilege. And it's the structures that give them that power and privilege. And unless you're willing to basically, refuse that power, to abdicate that power, if you like it, unless you're willing to do something different with the privilege that you either got that's unearned, or the privilege, like the pretty privilege, or this privilege that you got that somehow the structures gave you, unless you're willing to reckon with the power that comes with that privilege, we will always have these kinds of violence happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is also part of a whole conversation that we Palestinians think about, right? How does the abused become the abuser? In our context, right? How do the survivors of the Holocaust, of racism, of anti-Semitism, of horrendous evil, could easily perpetuate similar violence against the Palestinians? And we've seen this in Gaza, right? How just the complete disregard for the dignity of the Palestinians, showcasing their crimes on TikTok, and just the insane dehumanization of Palestinians. And it's shocking. Like, how could you, who grew up with that legacy of being a victim, could easily become a victimizer? And of course, not to excuse the Palestinian violence as well within the framework of resistance, right, and militarism, how also dehumanization of the Israeli and the Jewish person also happens in some of the discourse and some of the action of Palestinian militant resistance. Okay, well, that's obviously very sad and very problematic. So Sarojini, help us out. help us to think differently. Help us put on those lens that could help us think better about the scripture and all. I mean, how to think about Esther also, because I think that's part of your project. How to think about that book, but within a larger picture, how do we adopt that hermeneutical lens, which you refer to, use the different terms that might be a bit confusing or too technical for people, decolonial, feminist, womanist, Black. Help us think of these ways of interpretation and how they can help us out of this kind of quagmire of violence or sanctioned violence in the text.
Well, I mean, this is always difficult, especially when people hold texts as sacred, right? There are people who believe in, this is the literal word of God. We cannot challenge it. This is, divinely inspired text, and therefore, even what I'm doing here and the ways in which I am speaking about the text might be considered heretical. But I think that, the first step is honesty, right? We have to. I think you have to stop reading the story as a simple tale of courage and triumph, because that's the Sunday school version, right? We have to allow the story to disturb us. We have to ask the difficult questions, the things that sit uncomfortably with us. We have to go to that place of discomfort, and we have to ask, who suffers in the story?
Hi, friends. If you think the work we're doing here at Across the Divide is important, then I invite you to consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter. You can support the podcast for as little as $1 a month by visiting patreon.com/Across the Divide. By sustaining our work, you can also get access to exclusive conversations with our guests, merch discounts, and other opportunities to engage with the Across the Divide hosts and other listeners, like the Across the Divide Book Club. Join the small and beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up at patreon.com/Across the Divide. Thanks, friends.
We've been taught to believe that the only people that suffer in the story are the Jewish people and are Esther. But we have to ask, whose voices are missing here? Who pays the price for the survival of the Jewish nation? And to move towards that kind of liberative reading does not mean rejecting the Bible. But it does mean refusing to protect it from critique. We cannot protect the Bible from critique, and I think that's what gets us into the trouble that we are in currently. So to apply this hermeneutic, which is a big word to apply this tool, to apply this lens that I'm talking about, it means listening for the voices at the margins, not just the voices that we've been taught to listen for, but the voices that we not just ignore, but as Arundhati Roy says, we deliberately silence. So, the unnamed virgins in the text, the conquered enemies, the people erased from celebration. And then it also means, I think, recognizing the ways in which sacred texts shape moral imagination, right? The ways in which sacred texts shape how communities understand justice and belonging and violence. And I'm thinking here, for example, in the US, there's a whole Trump was referring to it even when he was campaigning. There's a project called Project Esther, right? It's actually named after Esther, and used exactly in the service of domination that we've been talking about.
So sorry to interrupt, Sirajin. Just to explain that project. So that's within Project 2025, a kind of Christian nationalist project in the US, but Project Esther is specifically targeting pro-Palestine voices in the US, framed within the kind of using the language of countering anti-Semitism in the US, especially because of what happened at university campuses. But basically a very rigorous system to prosecute and to silence and to dox pro-Palestine voices under that umbrella term of fighting anti-Semitism. Sorry, but yeah, go ahead.
No, and that's a really, and of course you in the US, so you have firsthand experience with this. But
Sure.
also when people said to me, some folks were asking me, is it really that bad? Is it really, why do you want to go to that part? Isn't it enough to stop with the sexual violence? Aren't you a feminist scholar? Why are you taking it to this end? And for me, I see the real world effects of this text. Like I said, the text, the project itself is named Project Esther, and that's not coincidental, right? That's not just by the way. It shows us the ways in which readings of particular sacred texts almost align automatically with the empire, almost align automatically with those already holding power. And so for me, the tool or what I want to achieve in this book is to ask us to read from the underside, to read with those who suffer, and I mean, that's a Jesus hermeneutic, right? That for me is what a real Jesus hermeneutic is. It's to read with those who are unnamed, those who are displaced, those who are erased. But also, it's not about finding neat answers, because the Book of Esther doesn't present us with neat answers. It's about wrestling. It is about responsibility. It's about recognizing that interpretation itself, or the art of interpretation, which is, of course, the science of hermeneutics, this word that we keep using, is not a neutral exercise. It's never a neutral exercise. The way we read sacred texts shapes how we live with one another. It shapes whether we see certain lives as worth protecting. And so the task for us is not to defend, it's neither, I think, to defend the text nor to discard it, though both are quite enticing, right? There are those who always want to defend the text, and there are those, I think, social justice activists who also say, no, we must discard the text, right? And I feel neither of those two positions are healthy. I think it is important to read in a way that refuses the domination, to imagine interpretations that stand with the vulnerable rather than the powerful. And for me, that's where liberation begins.
Yeah, I mean, you're following in the legacy of a lot of thinkers, and you refer to some of them in your book. When you think about Hagar, who is victimized, abused, pushed out. You think about the Canaanites. There's the article by Warrior that you mentioned as well. There are a lot of voices in the scriptures. Sometimes they have a voice, like Hagar, but many times they do not have a voice, and they've been flattened into just the bad, like the Canaanites. And this kind of creative way to read this lens is to, like you're saying, what we call in social teachings, and especially in Catholic liberation theology, is the preferential option for the poor, or the preferential option for the silent, or for the dispossessed, or what have you. And that follows a long legacy of what we call contextual theology. And that's where Black and feminist and womanist and Latin American Palestinian theology is part of that, where the Palestinian has also been silenced, where we're saying, hey, what if we center our interpretation on those silent minorities, or the abused, or those who suffer, and how does that shape or affect the way that we read the text and apply the text, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think my book follows precisely in that trajectory, right, of liberation theologies, asking us to make a preferential option for those I think if we speak of it as a as Christians, for those whom Jesus would read with,
Mm.
those whom Jesus would
The
side.
Samaritan woman, the
Exactly,
the naked, beaten up person at the side of the road, like these people that we have been dismissive of, right?
dismissive of. And earlier you said you constantly looking for ways to read bedtime stories to your
Mm.
kids, and I end the book actually making reference to this, because there are a number of scholars who suggest that to do what I'm doing with the text is to completely misunderstand it. It's to take it too literally. It is to to miss the historical and the narrative and all of that, because in fact there's one scholar, Esther Holt, who says, this is literary technique. The technique is that we want to tell the stories where people live happily ever after. So if you had to read the story to a child, that child will sleep well in the understanding that the evil is destroyed, and that people are safe, and the child will feel safe, and therefore that's the way to read the story. And I challenge that at the end of my book. And my question is, which child sleeps safely at the end of this telling? Which child? It's a child of privilege. It's a child of, it's a white child, it's a Jewish child, it's a male child. It's not the child of sexual violence. It's not a Palestinian child. It's not a child who experiences the other end, because it's only the child that can identify with the victors in the story that will sleep soundly, that can say, oh, and they all lived happily ever after, because they didn't. 75,000 people didn't live happily ever after at the end of this text. And so the idea is to use the tools that we have to challenge these normative assumptions of who gets to live happily ever after in the stories that we tell.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, it is challenging, right? How do we apply the text to our lives today? Obviously, the story of Esther has been read in a certain flat, triumphalist way, and we want to make the story of Esther into a bedtime story,
Yeah.
into a Sunday school story, and we do that with all the scriptures. Like, hey, how can I apply this to my life today? But without that critical interrogation, you call this like a text of terrorism, right? Like
Yes.
that text of terrorism becomes normal. Yeah, it makes sense that she would do this. And that kind of reading that doesn't want to wrestle with the moral implications of the text. And I think the tragedy, right, and that's something that we Palestinians have been wrestling with, is like, how come the text is so easily weaponized?
Yeah.
And I think that's how it happens, right? Like when you
Yeah.
read that story of Esther and 75,000 people are killed, oh, that's cool, that's good, that's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, it is what it is. That's revelation, quote unquote revelation.
Yeah.
And we're refusing to reckon with the tension that the text is creating for us, just like it does with the Canaanites, just like it does with Hagar. So I think there's, to emphasize this idea of revelation, that the text is not trying to, while it seems to be trying to flatten and symbolize the narrative, it intentionally includes the contradiction. It still includes that for us. We choose to flatten it and simplify it and have a rosy version of it, but the text is not doing that. We're forcing the text to do that.
Absolutely. The text is not doing that. The text itself is complex. Esther is complex, right? She's shaped by the violent systems around her, and she's navigating survival in a world where power comes at a cost. And so I think this is one of the hardest truths of the text, that victims do not always remain only victims. Sometimes they become participants in systems that harm others, and that's why the harem and the harem reveal two sides of the same structure. Right, one controls women's bodies, and the other controls populations, but both those systems operate through power, and both of those systems decide whose lives matter and whose lives do not matter, what I call in the book theological necropolitics, whose lives matter in this text. And so the text, I think, in as much as some of the structures of the text might seek to flatten, there's enough space for us to have to see the complexity, but that requires us to be resisting readers, if you like, to be readers that also read with our own social locations. I don't think the text is meant for us to simply read it in its own, oh, that's what happened then, and the fact that Netanyahu uses it, the fact that it's in this Heritage Foundation document on anti-Semitism, the fact that it's core Project Esther means that this text exists in our current moment in a way that is causing the destruction of lives and causing people to lose their livelihoods, and that in itself should compel us to look at this text differently. It's not a simple tale.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yes, I agree completely with you. We said we're going to stay away from theological jargon, but then you use the phrase theological necropolitics. I'm like, Sarojini, no.
Sorry.
No, you're good. But just to explain that term, necro, the body, the necropolitics, the politics of the bodies, and then the theological framing is how theology creates that kind of way to control bodies and humans and dead bodies and alive bodies in a very oppressive way. But anyway, so let's end this conversation with kind of practical advice. You gave us the theoretical one. Read the text from the lens of those who suffer. So Esther as a peasant, sexually victimized person, but also Esther as a victimizer, and also the 75,000 plus 500 who were terrorized and killed, and who with no fault of their own. They were not responsible for the scheming of Haman. So for Christians who have, and others, right, who have been awakened to how that the Bible has been weaponized, especially in Gaza, how practically, how do they move forward? I think the theoretical is there. Well, side with the victim, the silent. But how do you extend this to our church communities or our social work or our job, the market? What does it look like to have that decolonial, even feminist reading of the text, or Black or Palestinian, that could have a practical application to our faith life and also practical life?
Yeah, I don't have easy answers for this, I must confess. It's both a daily personal struggle, because you'll be surprised, but even here in South Africa, where we've taken, as you know, a very courageous stance, right? And in fact, in the book as well, I refer to the ICJ case that South Africa brought to the case of genocide. But even in South Africa, where we, at least we can speak freely, right? We have a government that allows us to speak freely. We're not going to get arrested, whatever. But even here, it is a struggle. We encounter people on a daily basis that challenge this, that, God, if you bless Israel, you will be blessed. If you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. It's this constant everyday theologies. And I feel like the only way to engage that is to do so in an everyday way. If that makes sense, it's to. I'd really like to say, we could have some sort of big program and we could start contextual Bible study, and we can do all of those things, but it also starts in our daily interactions, right? The other challenge, I think, and practically, this is a huge challenge, is a lot of our social justice activists, people who have, and I know this because I'm constantly in feminist spaces and in spaces where people have such a strong commitment to the freedom of Palestinians, but they are embarrassed by religion. They're embarrassed by the discussion of religion. And so I am constantly challenging them. Last year, I wrote an opinion piece when Netanyahu made his speech at the United Nations I think it was around September at the end. And he was citing scripture left, right, and center, like he was a rabbi almost, And I use that as an example in my opinion piece to say that we cannot dismiss religion as some dismiss it as these are just silly people, and actually the issue here is politics, and the issue is land, and the issue is if we can just get the politics right, we'll resolve this. Religion is at the heart of this, and we can't keep dismissing religion. So we have to reckon seriously, and this is my challenge, is how to engage academics and how to engage people who have their hearts are in the right places, but they don't take religion seriously, is for how, like, look, this is what's being done. Religion is at the heart of this. So for me, that's a very practical thing in my own sphere that I try to work on.
100%. Yeah. And I think there's a skill to be developed for all of us who want to work in that space of liberation and of justice and of peacemaking, is to always be sensitive to power and to abuse and to violence.
Yes.
And just reckon that our calling, our mission, our work has to be consistently antithetical to domination and power and violence. And especially when so much in our society there's a deference to power and to violence, that it's a sanctioned and it's holy war and holy violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's legitimate state violence, no matter what, and to always have that sensitivity or that hermeneutic, that lens we always put on. Where are the poor? Where are the silent? Where are the marginalized? Whether it's the immigrants, women, any kind of ethnic or religious minority. And then we center our attention to them and we try to put ourselves in their shoes. Say, okay, well, if I was that person, how does that affect the way that I think about this policy or this, work function or this social activity, when I'm paying attention to the least of these? Yes. I think that's such a hard task, but that's just the only task I think we should be involved in, is to resist that temptation of power and domination, and to move, following that. Again, this is very Christocentric. This is very Christ-centric.
Yeah.
To go to the least of these. Whatever we do to the least of these, we're doing it to Christ himself. And if we have that ethic, that lens, I think it could be very transformative in the way that we function in our homes, in the market, at government, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I think lived experience is a huge part of that, right? Like, so often we are told to bracket our lived experience, to come only with faith, to come only with, Jesus is my savior kind of understanding, without recognizing the importance of our lived experience in reading for the gospel, in trying to find the gospel in what we are saying. And I think about, why South Africans in particular, and Black South Africans in particular, why Desmond Tutu was so, he was so attuned to the suffering of the Palestinians. It's because we experience apartheid in our bones. We get apartheid. Nobody understands apartheid better than us. And I think when you've experienced it in your bones, then you can find the affinities. Then you can find the connections, and so we have to encourage people to listen to those who have the lived experience of suffering. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Fantastic. Sarojini, this could go, I could talk to you for another 3 hours, but we have to end it here. This is such a helpful way to think. And I think we just have to have that lived, practical way to think, and hopefully our experiences of suffering, rather than making us, like Esther, blind to the suffering of others. And hopefully that would transform us to be like like Christ in the way, or how the text wants to challenge us to also center those who are marginalized and abused in the text and also in our lives. So Rajani, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Appreciate you.
It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Did you like this episode? If so, make sure to follow Across the Divide and share it with friends and family. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, and perhaps leave a comment or a like. It actually helps the podcast to reach more people. To support our work, to get exclusive content, perhaps to join our book club, head over to patreon.com/acrossthedivide.